There was a roof the color of a traffic cone, and underneath it, 28 flavors of ice cream, a plate of fried clams, and the particular feeling that no matter where in America you happened to be, you were somewhere familiar. Howard Johnson's was not just a restaurant. At its peak, it was the largest food service chain in the entire country, bigger than McDonald's, bigger than anyone. And then, almost without explanation, it vanished. This is how that happened. What it was, before we get to the decline, we need to spend a moment with the thing itself, because Howard Johnson's at its height was a specific experience, and specific experiences are hard to reconstruct from the outside. But it is worth trying, because without it, the loss doesn't quite land the way it should. Put yourself in a car. It is a summer sometime in the 1960s, maybe the early 1970s, and your family has been on the highway long enough that the novelty wore off somewhere around the second hour. The back seat has become a negotiated territory with an invisible border running down the middle. Someone has asked how much farther at least 4 times. The radio is playing something nobody particularly wanted to hear. And then, somebody sees it. The roof. That orange, which was not quite like any other orange in the built environment. Not the orange of construction cones or autumn leaves, but something more deliberate than either of those. A color chosen to be seen from a moving car at highway speed and to mean something the moment it was recognized. Turquoise trim along the edges. The simple Simon weather vane at the peak. The little figure with his fishing pole, turning slowly in whatever wind was blowing off the highway that afternoon. And from the back seat, from the front seat, from wherever you were sitting, something changed. The arithmetic of the trip rearranged itself, because everyone in that car knew exactly what that roof meant. It meant fried clams in a paper boat, the clams themselves tender and lightly battered in a way that managed to feel like a treat, even though you had eaten them before and would eat them again. It meant a hot dog that had been split lengthwise and pressed flat on the griddle until the cut side crisped. That sounds like a minor thing, and it is not a minor thing at all once you have had one. It meant a laminated menu that was longer than a roadside menu had any business being, with actual options, with things to deliberate over, with food that had been thought about by someone. And it meant the ice cream. 28 flavors, which in an era when the standard offer was vanilla, chocolate, and if you were lucky, strawberry, felt like stepping into a different understanding of what dessert could be. Peach, burgundy cherry, mocha chip, frozen pudding, banana. Each flavor had a name that sounded like it had been arrived at with genuine care by someone who took the question of ice cream seriously and thought you should too. The inside of every Howard Johnson's looked like the inside of every other Howard Johnson's. Orange and turquoise carried through from the exterior. Dark wood trim. Booths that were comfortable without making a production of it. Lighting that did not flatten everything or make anyone look unwell. A counter with stools you could spin if the waitress wasn't watching. Everything about it said the same thing, in the same tone of voice. We know what we are doing here. We have been doing it for a long time, and you can relax. For a family 4 hours into a drive with 200 miles still to go, that was not a small reassurance. That was the whole afternoon turning around. How it rose, the man behind all of it was Howard Deering Johnson, and his story is one of the great entrepreneurial origin stories of the 20th century, even though almost nobody tells it anymore. In 1925, Johnson was a young man in Quincy, Massachusetts, who had just taken over a small drugstore with a soda fountain. He had almost no money and a significant amount of debt he had inherited along with the business. What he had, though, was a recipe. His neighbor, an elderly German pushcart vendor, had a formula for ice cream made with twice the butter fat of standard commercial ice cream. Johnson bought the recipe, started selling the ice cream from the fountain and from beachside carts, and discovered something important. people would go out of their way for it. They would travel for it. They would bring their families. By 1929, he had opened his first proper restaurant in Quincy. By the mid-1930s, he had more than 100 locations up and down the East Coast. And here is the part of the story that is genuinely remarkable. He did most of that expansion without much capital of his own, because he had pioneered, almost by accident, what we would now recognize as the modern franchise model. Operators would pay for the right to use his name, his recipes, his distinctive look. He would supply the quality control and the brand recognition. It was a system built for scale, and it worked. But what truly launched Howard Johnson's into the stratosphere was not his business model. It was asphalt. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of the interstate highway system, 41,000 miles of new road connecting every corner of the country. And almost overnight, America became a nation of drivers. The family road trip went from a regional curiosity to a national ritual. People were covering distances they had never covered before, stopping in towns they had never heard of, eating in places they had never been. And in that context, the Howard Johnson's orange roof was not just a logo. It was a promise. You did not have to wonder whether the local diner was clean. You did not have to gamble on whether the food would be edible. You saw the roof, you knew what you were getting, and in a country suddenly hurtling down unfamiliar roads at 60 miles an hour, that kind of certainty was worth pulling off the highway for. By 1965, there were more than 700 Howard Johnson's restaurants operating across the United States. The company had also moved aggressively into motor lodges, building them adjacent to the restaurants so that families could eat and sleep under the same trustworthy orange roof. Howard Johnson's was not just a restaurant chain, it was infrastructure. Why it mattered. It is easy, from where we are standing now, to miss what Howard Johnson's was actually doing. The thing it provided has become so routine, so built into the fabric of how we eat and travel, that it no longer registers as something someone had to invent. But it was invented. And before it existed, the alternative was genuinely worse. Think about what it meant to stop for a meal on an American highway in the 1940s or early 1950s. You pulled off at an exit you had never taken before, walked into a diner or a roadside cafe you had never heard of, and you had no information. None. There was no rating on your phone, no photograph of the food, no reviews from strangers on the internet telling you whether the kitchen was clean or the cook was reliable. You sat down, you ordered, and you found out. Sometimes it was wonderful. Sometimes it was a grilled cheese that tasted like the grill had not been cleaned since the Truman administration. And occasionally, memorably, it was worse than that. Families who drove long distances in that era have stories. Most of those stories involve a rest stop somewhere in Ohio and a meal they wished they had skipped. What Howard Johnson's offered, at its core, was the elimination of that particular anxiety. And if that sounds like a small thing, it wasn't. It was a genuinely significant thing to be able to say to your family, "We are stopping here, and I know what we are going to get." The fried clams were going to taste the way they had tasted last summer, at a different Howard Johnson's, in a different state, 400 miles away. The macaroni and cheese was going to be the same. The strawberry ice cream was going to be the same. The counter was going to look familiar. The menu was going to be readable, and everyone was going home healthy. For parents traveling with children, this was not a convenience. It was a relief. Children are not adventurous eaters as a rule, and a long drive with a tired, hungry child who refuses to eat what is in front of them is one of the more wearing experiences family travel has to offer. Howard Johnson's removed that variable entirely. You walked in and the kids already knew what they wanted because they had wanted it the last time too. That kind of predictability is underrated until you understand what it was replacing. But there was something larger going on as well, something that went beyond the practical matter of feeding a family without incident. When a family from Maine, and a family from Georgia, and a family from somewhere in the middle of Ohio, all sat down in nearly identical booths and ordered from nearly identical menus and ate more or less the same meal, something was happening between them, even though they never spoke. They were sharing an experience. In a country as wide and various and regionally distinct as the United States, Howard Johnson's was, without particularly meaning to be, a place where Americans held something in common. That was not nothing. That was quietly quite a lot. The cracks begin. Howard Johnson Sr. died in 1972, and control of the company passed to his son, Howard Johnson Jr., and this is where the story starts to change. It is not entirely fair to lay the collapse of Howard Johnson's at the feet of one man or one decision. The forces that were gathering against the chain by the early 1970s were large and various and structural. But the transition in leadership did coincide with a critical window, a moment when the company needed to adapt and did not. The competition had arrived. McDonald's, which had been a modest regional chain in the late 1950s, had by the early 1970s become something genuinely formidable. Burger King was expanding. Wendy's opened in 1969. Holiday Inn was dominating the Motor Lodge space. Kentucky Fried Chicken had gone national. A new generation of food businesses had studied what Howard Johnson's had built and had improved on it in specific targeted ways. They were faster, they were cheaper, they were simpler. And this is the thing about simplicity. It is easy to dismiss it as a lowering of standards, but that is not quite what it was. What McDonald's understood, what the new fast food chains understood, was that the American consumer was changing. The family road trip was still happening, but it was becoming more rushed. Two-income households were becoming more common. Time was becoming more valuable. People did not always want to sit down, order from a laminated menu, wait for their food, and then wait for the check. Sometimes they wanted to eat in the car. Howard Johnson's menu, once its greatest selling point, was beginning to look like a liability. It was enormous, which meant the kitchens were complex, which meant the training was harder, which meant the inconsistency crept in. Franchisees who had bought into the system years earlier were aging, and not all of them were maintaining the standards that the brand required. Reports of declining quality started to accumulate. The orange roof, which had once meant a guarantee, was beginning to mean a question mark. The 1973 oil crisis did not help. Road travel dropped sharply, and Howard Johnson's, which had built its entire business model around the American driver, felt the impact immediately. Food costs were rising, profit margins were tightening, and the company was trying to compete against chains that had been engineered from the ground up for efficiency, while Howard Johnson's was still running a system designed for a different era. The menu stayed too complicated for too long. The prices stayed too high for too long. The decor stayed the same for too long. And while the chain was standing still, everything around it was moving. The collapse. In 1979, Howard Johnson's was sold to Imperial Industries of Britain, and with that transaction, something fundamental changed, even if you could not see it yet from the highway. The company that Howard Johnson Sr. had built from a soda fountain in Quincy was no longer a family enterprise with a name and a reputation to protect. It was a portfolio holding. It was a line on a balance sheet. And the people now responsible for it were not thinking about fried clams or 28 flavors. They were thinking about return on investment. And those are very different things to be thinking about. What followed was a quiet dismantling, conducted over years in the language of business decisions that each seemed individually reasonable and collectively devastating. The motor lodges were separated from the restaurants. Two things that had existed as a single experience for decades. The orange roof where you ate and the orange roof where you slept were now officially different businesses, with different owners and no particular obligation to each other. If you had grown up Stopping at Howard Johnson's on family-friendly road trips, you understood instinctively what that combination had meant. You ate dinner, you walked across the parking lot, you went to bed, and in the morning, you had breakfast in the same building where you'd had pie the night before. That was the whole idea. Once it was divided, something essential about it was gone, even if the signs still looked the same for a while. The closures came steadily through the 1980s. Not all at once, not in a single announcement, but location by location, exit by exit. A restaurant that had been there for 30 years would be there one summer and gone by the next. The orange roofs came down. The weather vanes stopped spinning. Other chains moved in, other signs went up, and the exits kept going. But they were different now in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not known them before. By 1988, the number of Howard Johnson's restaurants had fallen below 400. By the mid-1990s, it was in the dozens. The ownership changed hands again, and again after that. The brand drifted into a kind of legal half-life, a name that still existed on paper, licensed and sub-licensed in ways that had less and less connection to anything the original company had been. By 2017, there was one Howard Johnson's restaurant left in the entire country, one. In Lake George, New York, it was operated by a man named John Petras, who had run the place since the 1980s and who simply would not close it. He kept the original recipes. He kept the counter and the swivel stools and the 28 flavors. He kept the whole thing going by himself, as if sheer refusal could hold back what had already happened everywhere else. Petras died in 2022. The Lake George location closed shortly after. There are no Howard Johnson's restaurants left in the continental United States. What we lost here is the thing about ubiquity. You do not appreciate it until it is gone. When Howard Johnson's was everywhere, it was easy to take for granted, easy to drive past on the way to something more interesting or more exotic. It was dependable in the way that telephone poles are dependable, always there, rarely noticed, and suddenly conspicuous in their absence. What we lost when we lost Howard Johnson's was not, strictly speaking, great food. The fried clams were good. The ice cream was genuinely excellent. But nobody was confusing a Hojo's with a fine dining experience. What we lost was something harder to replace, which was a shared point of reference. A thing that millions of Americans across decades and regions and economic circumstances all had in common. There is a particular kind of comfort that comes from the familiar. Not the familiar you grew up with, not the familiar of home, but the familiar of the road, the familiar of the away from home that has been made to feel manageable. Howard Johnson's was that. It was the thing that made a strange highway exit feel navigable, that made a long trip feel punctuated by something reliable, that made a kid in the back seat believe the world had been organized, at least in this one small way, for their benefit. When chains like this disappear, the map of the country changes in a way that is difficult to articulate and impossible to measure. The exits keep existing, the highways keep going, but something about the texture of the journey is different now, less legible, less shared. There is a version of Howard Johnson's that still exists in memory, and memory is remarkably faithful to it. People who ate there as children can describe the exact shade of orange, the exact weight of the laminated menu, the exact sound of a metal scoop hitting the ice cream tub behind the counter. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. It means something was done well enough and often enough to leave a mark. Howard Johnson's rose because it understood something true about what people need when they are far from home. It fell because it could not figure out how to stay true to that understanding as the world changed around it. Most things fail for exactly that reason, and most things are mourned for exactly the reason Howard Johnson's is mourned. Not because they were perfect, but because they were present, and now they are not. If you remember Howard Johnson's, tell someone about it. Tell them what you ordered. Tell them what it looked like. Tell them which exit it was on. Those stories are worth keeping. And if this is the kind of history you find yourself thinking about, the ordinary places and the everyday rituals that shaped what America felt like from the inside, then subscribe, because there is a great deal more where this came from. The orange roofs are gone, but they were real and they mattered, and that is enough.